When five musicians emerged from the shadows of Bob Dylan in 1968, they seemed inseparable. Living together in a pink house, creating music that defined a generation, and sharing nearly everything. Yet by 2005, their drummer Levon Helm was filing for bankruptcy while guitarist Robbie Robertson lived comfortably in Malibu. "I had to play shows in my barn just to keep the bank from taking my home," Helm would later admit, his voice ravaged by cancer treatments he struggled to afford. The numbers reveal a shocking disparity. The band's self-titled album sold over 1.1 million copies and generated approximately $4.2 million in revenue. Yet the musicians who created this American masterpiece experienced wildly different financial fates. This gulf between bandmates hints at deeper conflicts that would ultimately tear apart these once equal partners. In 1968, five musicians stood at a crucial crossroads. After years as Bob Dylan's backing group, they were ready to emerge from the shadow of a folk legend and create their own legacy. Robbie Robertson, Rick Danko, Richard Manuel, Garth Hudson, and Levon Helm had built chemistry through countless shows. But now they faced their most important test, transforming their musical brotherhood into a sustainable business. Capitol Records saw something special in this eclectic group of four Canadians and one Southerner. Their blend of Americana, folk, and rock felt both revolutionary and nostalgic. The label offered the five musicians a $25,000 advance when they signed in early 1968. Modest compared to what other major acts received, but in line with most emerging artists of the era. Unlike modern deals where labels take percentages of all revenue streams, Capitol's contract focused primarily on record sales, with royalty rates that gave the band pennies per album sold. This capital allowed them to focus exclusively on their music rather than taking side gigs, and funded their move to Big Pink. The five musicians divided this money equally, approximately $5,000 per member, planting seeds in seemingly identical soil that would later grow in dramatically different directions. The advance enabled Robertson and his colleagues to settle into a pink house in West Saugerties, New York, near Woodstock. Known as Big Pink, this humble dwelling became both home and creative headquarters. All five members lived in similar modest conditions, sharing meals, writing music, and refining their unique sound. "We were all in pretty much the same boat financially back then," Levon Helm later recalled in his autobiography, This Wheel's on Fire. "Nobody had fancy cars or big houses. We were just making music and getting by on about $75 to $100 a week for expenses." This financial equality masked a pivotal business decision taking root. As they prepared their debut album, Music from Big Pink, the attribution of songwriting credits emerged as a critical issue. While their creative process was deeply collaborative, with members contributing arrangements, melodies, and lyrical ideas, the formal documentation of authorship would determine how money flowed for decades to come. The music publishing industry of the late 1960s operated on a fundamentally different economic model than recording or performing. While record royalties were typically split evenly among band members, publishing operated on a parallel track with much higher margins. Publishers collected 50% of all songwriter royalties, with the remaining 50% going to credited composers. This meant that for every dollar generated from radio plays, cover versions, or print music, Robertson would receive significantly more than his bandmates. As their manager Albert Grossman knew from handling Bob Dylan's publishing, these rights were extraordinarily valuable long-term assets. While performance royalties might generate quick cash, publishing rights created generational wealth. The standard industry practice of the era, unlike groups like the Beatles who often shared credits regardless of who wrote what, was to assign rights based on technical authorship, a practice that would create vastly different financial outcomes for these five musicians. The debut album's credits reveal the pattern. Robertson received writing credit on 8 of the 11 tracks, sometimes sharing with Manuel or Danko, but often as sole composer. This technical detail carried enormous financial implications. In the music industry, songwriting royalties typically generate 50% of all publishing revenue, while the other 50% goes to the publisher, with no money going to non-credited performers regardless of their contributions to the final sound. When Music from Big Pink was released in July 1968, it didn't achieve immediate commercial success, peaking at just number 30 on the Billboard charts and eventually selling around 560,000 copies, enough for gold certification. This translated to approximately $2.2 million in revenue, but the band members saw only a fraction of this after label costs, management fees, and advances were recouped. However, it earned critical acclaim that positioned the group for future success. More importantly, it established the blueprint for how money would flow through these musicians' business structure. Albert Grossman, their manager who previously guided Dylan's career, understood the power of publishing rights better than the musicians themselves. During one contract negotiation, Grossman reportedly emphasized that the songwriters make the real money in this business, about $4,000 per song in publishing advance alone, while ensuring Robertson's position as primary composer became contractually solidified. Warning signs appeared during early recording sessions. Robertson emerged as the dominant voice in business decisions, while other members focused primarily on performance. Hudson, despite contributing sophisticated arrangements, received minimal songwriting recognition. Helm, whose authentic Southern voice became central to the group's identity, rarely received writing credit despite his influence on their sound. The band's self-titled second album in 1969 dramatically increased their visibility and commercial appeal, selling approximately 1.1 million copies and earning platinum certification, generating around $4.2 million in revenue. As their popularity grew, so did the financial stakes and the imbalance in how money flowed to different members. The equal splits of performance royalties, approximately $35,000 per member, couldn't counterbalance the growing disparity in publishing income, where Robertson earned an estimated additional $175,000 in songwriting royalties, creating financial fault lines that would eventually fracture their foundation. When the 5 musicians took the stage at Woodstock in 1969, the crowd saw 5 musical equals performing as one. Behind their harmonious sound, however, an invisible financial divide was taking shape that would eventually tear apart one of rock's most influential groups. Their self-titled 1969 album dramatically increased their commercial appeal and earning power. The group quickly graduated to performing at massive venues. On June 14, 1970, they played Anaheim Stadium to nearly 43,000 fans, a stark contrast from their usual mid-sized venues. Between 1969 and 1974, they performed at landmark events like Woodstock and the Isle of Wight Festival, cementing their status as major concert draws and commanding up to $50,000 per show. On stage, they presented perfect unity. Offstage, their financial reality told a different story. While performance fees and album advances were distributed relatively equally, approximately $10,000 per member per major show, songwriting credits created a profound economic imbalance that grew with each album release. For every $1 million in publishing royalties generated, Robertson received approximately $500,000, while the others collectively earned nothing from this revenue stream. This financial disparity was built into the music industry's standard payment structures. Performance royalties, which all band members shared equally, generated significantly less income than publishing royalties that went to credited songwriters. This structural imbalance was particularly pronounced for the band because Robertson dominated their songwriting credits. Unlike groups like Fleetwood Mac or the Eagles, where multiple members wrote songs, the band's arrangement concentrated wealth in one member's hands. By 1974, Robertson had hired David Geffen to manage his personal finances separately from the group, a strategic move that demonstrated his understanding of the true value of his publishing portfolio compared to the band's shared performance income. Rick Danko, who co-wrote This Wheel's on Fire, experienced the financial potential firsthand. "That song brought me a couple $100,000 out of left field," he later recalled to journalist Rob Bowman in 1989. That one song alone paid more than 5 years of performing. For members without such credits, these substantial payments remained frustratingly out of reach. The financial gap soon manifested in their lifestyles. By 1974, Robertson had moved to a beachfront Malibu property, purchased for approximately $240,000, a tangible symbol of his growing prosperity. Meanwhile, his bandmates maintained modest living arrangements, spending primarily on musical equipment or covering daily expenses rather than building long-term wealth. Far too much cash was coming down in Robertson's and Albert's corner, Levon Helm stated bluntly in his 1993 autobiography. "By my calculations, about 90% of the money for writing and publishing was going to Robbie and Albert Grossman." Critical financial arrangements were reportedly made without consulting all members, creating deep-seated resentment. This economic disparity widened as their career progressed. Concert fees might be divided equally among the 5 musicians, $10,000 each for major shows. But the industry's true wealth generator, royalties from radio play, album sales, and cover versions, created a separate revenue stream flowing primarily to Robertson. For every significant hit song, Robertson earned an estimated $80,000 to $100,000 in publishing advances alone, plus ongoing royalties. Manuel, Danko, Hudson, and Helm gradually recognized these arrangements' long-term implications. Their touring income couldn't match the sustainable wealth that publishing rights provided. Each spin on the radio generated royalty payments primarily benefiting Robertson, creating a system where financial inequality increased with the group's success. By 1974, industry analysts estimate the publishing catalog was generating approximately $400,000 annually, with Robertson receiving about 90% of this amount. This created a paradoxical situation. These musicians could perform for 40,000 enthusiastic fans one night, while some members struggled financially the next day. In the early 1970s music industry, ownership of compositions, not performances, generated lasting wealth for musicians, with the composer typically earning 2 to 3 cents per album sold, compared to 6 to 8 cents for performers. Personal financial decisions further amplified these disparities. Robertson focused on protecting his publishing rights as an investment, while some other members made costly financial missteps or prioritized immediate needs over long-term security. Their different approaches to money management magnified the effects of the unequal royalty distribution. The resentment became increasingly difficult to ignore. How could musicians sharing the same stage, recording the same albums, and traveling in the same tour bus live in such different economic circumstances? This question lingered during recording sessions and backstage conversations, creating tension that eventually undermined their ability to function as a cohesive unit. The financial divide that began with publishing credits would ultimately prove fatal to one of rock's most celebrated collaborations. The unsustainable financial strain finally found its release valve in what became rock's most elegant goodbye. The crystal chandeliers, suspended from Winterland Ballroom's ceiling, cast a warm glow over 5,000 formally dressed concert-goers consuming turkey dinners on white tablecloths. The elaborate stage, borrowed from the San Francisco Opera's production of La Traviata, formed a dramatic backdrop for what appeared to be a fond farewell. but was actually the culmination of years of growing business tensions. When the musical group announced their farewell concert in 1976, music fans saw only the star-studded lineup and heard only the perfect harmonies. What they couldn't see was the business arrangement that would further widen the already substantial economic divide between five legendary musicians. November 25, 1976, at San Francisco's Winterland Ballroom marked the setting for a carefully orchestrated business venture disguised as a fond farewell. Concertgoers paid $25 per ticket, a premium price for the era, which included a Thanksgiving dinner served to 5,000 attendees, generating approximately $125,000 in ticket revenue alone. While the event appeared to be a mutual celebration of the group's legacy, the financial structure behind it revealed the fractures that had been forming for years. The Warner Brothers deal that financed The Last Waltz exposed the power dynamics shaping the project. The studio reportedly invested $400,000 in the production, but Bob Dylan's participation wasn't just artistically significant. It was a non-negotiable requirement financially essential to the entire operation. This stipulation demonstrated how external relationships determined the project's viability and ultimately influenced who would benefit most from its success. The concert film's reported production budget of $35,000 seemed implausible given the elaborate filming using 7 35mm cameras operated by renowned cinematographers under Martin Scorsese's direction, with the actual costs likely exceeding $800,000. This disparity between stated costs and production quality hints at the complex financial arrangements that would later become contentious among band members. When the film premiered in 1978, its modest $323,012 box office, split between $321,952 domestic and $1,060 international, represented just one revenue stream in an expanding financial ecosystem that included soundtrack sales, approximately 220,000 units, generating $880,000, television rights, and home video distribution. Yet according to Levon Helm in his 1993 autobiography, Warner Brothers has released the film on VHS, Laserdisc, and DVD, and there have been a couple of soundtrack albums. None of us has ever received a check for any of it. He estimated the lost revenue at millions of dollars. This financial exclusion would fuel decades of resentment. The camera's focus throughout the film heavily favored Robertson, effectively positioning him as the band's frontman and creative force, a visual narrative that shaped public perception and future earnings potential. According to film production notes, Robertson appeared in 42% of total screen time, compared to 16% for Helm, 15% for Danko, 14% for Hudson, and 13% for Manuel. This on-screen imbalance perfectly mirrored the financial reality developing behind closed doors. As the musical collective officially dissolved, each member faced dramatically different financial futures. Robertson, with his substantial publishing catalog generating steady royalty income, estimated at $350,000 annually, and new relationships with film directors secured a comfortable transition to a solo career. Meanwhile, his former bandmates entered uncertain financial terrain without the publishing income he enjoyed, forcing them to rely on touring and session work to maintain their livelihoods, with earnings dropping to approximately $40,000 to $60,000 annually. The stark contrast between the group's collaborative musical identity and its imbalanced financial structure created lasting bitterness. On record, these musicians embodied musical democracy, instruments and voices intertwining without ego or showmanship. Yet financially, this democratic spirit had vanished years earlier, replaced by an arrangement that directed the majority of long-term earnings to a single member. In the concert's aftermath, these financial disparities became impossible to ignore. While Robertson settled into a comfortable future in Malibu with multiple revenue streams, Others faced rebuilding their careers from significantly disadvantaged positions. The farewell that appeared so celebratory on stage had actually set the stage for decades of resentment. The Last Waltz, celebrated for its artistic achievement, marked both the end of this musical partnership and the beginning of a financial divide that would outlive some of its members. What started as 5 musicians with equal footing had transformed into a business entity where financial benefits flowed disproportionately toward one member. The glamour of that November night masked a fundamental inequality that would haunt these legendary musicians long after the Winterland Ballroom went dark. When the curtain fell on this legendary musical collective, it revealed not just the end of a musical era, but the beginning of 5 distinct financial journeys. The same hands that once crafted harmony on stage would soon experience anything but harmony in their bank accounts. Robbie Robertson transformed his publishing rights into a steady income stream that sustained him even during creative dry spells. By the 1990s, Robertson reportedly owned 90% of the publishing rights for songs he had written, with Helm retaining just 10%. Industry experts estimate this publishing catalog generated approximately $750,000 annually by the mid-1990s. His collaboration with Martin Scorsese opened lucrative film scoring opportunities, beginning with Carney in 1980, earning him $60,000, and extending to major films like The Color of Money and Casino. These projects generated substantial revenue his bandmates couldn't access, with film scoring work typically paying $125,000 to $400,000 per project. Levon Helm faced a drastically different reality. By the late 1990s, he encountered a devastating combination: throat cancer, requiring extensive treatments at Memorial Sloan Kettering, costing approximately $180,000, and a house fire that destroyed his possessions valued at approximately $160,000. Medical bills mounted rapidly, damaging both his vocal cords and financial stability. The situation deteriorated until June 1, 2005, when Helm filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, later converting to Chapter 11 on August 8, 2005, to protect what little remained. Court documents revealed debts exceeding $400,000 against limited assets. Rick Danko struggled with diminishing opportunities. His 1997 arrest for heroin possession in Japan resulted in a 3-month suspended sentence and severely restricted his international touring options, cutting off essential income for a musician without significant publishing royalties. His annual income dropped to approximately $65,000, less than 1/10 of Robertson's earnings during the same period. Where he once played to thousands with the band, Danko found himself performing in venues that sometimes held fewer than 100 patrons, earning $1,500 to $2,500 per show compared to the $10,000 he earned at his peak. For Richard Manuel, financial and personal pressures proved unbearable. The combined weight of addiction, depression, and money problems created an overwhelming burden. His income had declined to approximately $45,000 annually, with debts reportedly exceeding $100,000. Friends recalled seeing him counting coins at a restaurant table to ensure he could cover a modest meal. His once impressive home was sold, replaced by extended stays in roadside motels. On March 4, 1986, following a performance at the Quality Inn in Winter Park, Florida, Manuel took his own life at age 42. In his motel room, police found just $35 in cash and a wallet containing maxed-out credit cards, a stark indicator of how far his financial situation had fallen. His tragic end illustrated how the music industry's focus on songwriting over performance could leave even legendary performers vulnerable when fame receded. Garth Hudson, despite his musical genius, faced mounting financial difficulties. His income as a session musician proved inconsistent and inadequate, averaging approximately $35,000 annually by the late 1990s. By 2013, His situation had deteriorated so severely that he couldn't afford storage payments of $4,900 for his musical artifacts and personal belongings. The public auction of these items to cover unpaid rent revealed the keyboard virtuoso's financial struggles. These disparities stemmed directly from business arrangements established during the musical group's formation. All 5 musicians had created their signature sound collaboratively, but the industry's wealth mechanism, publishing royalties, flowed primarily to Robertson. This imbalance only widened with the emergence of digital platforms and streaming services. Financial reports indicate that by the late 1990s, the gap had grown exponential. Robertson's annual income from the band's catalog exceeded $850,000, while his former bandmates collectively earned less than $200,000 from the same body of work. By the late 1990s, while Robertson enjoyed his multi-million-dollar catalog generating substantial passive income, Helm transformed his Woodstock barn into a concert venue out of necessity. These midnight ramble sessions began as desperate measures to pay medical bills, each session generating $15,000 to $25,000, but ultimately helped revitalize Helm's career before his 2012 death, bringing him a measure of financial stability in his final years. The group's story reveals how initial business decisions can create vastly different financial futures. 5 musicians who once shared stages, studios, and creative triumphs found themselves separated not just by artistic choices, but by bank balances that reflected the music industry's unforgiving economics. Those small barn concerts that saved Helm financially represented just pennies compared to what the musical collective's catalog would soon be worth. In an era when legendary catalogs command staggering sums, Queen's music rights selling for $1.27 billion, Pink Floyd's for $400 million, and Genesis for $300 million. The financial stakes around the band's musical legacy have escalated dramatically. Industry valuations suggest their catalog could be worth $35 to $45 million in today's market. Behind the scenes, decisions made over 50 years ago would determine who controlled and profited from a fortune none of them could have imagined in their Woodstock days. The digital revolution transformed the music industry's economics almost overnight. Physical album sales that once generated modest royalties became streaming platforms, delivering millions of plays across the globe. For classic rock acts like these musicians, this shift created an unprecedented surge in catalog value. Songs that might have earned $50,000 annually in the CD era now generate steady, substantial revenue streams worth $250,000 to $350,000 annually in today's streaming economy. Industry analysts widely acknowledge that streaming has fundamentally altered the economics for legacy artists, with catalog values increasing tenfold in many cases, making old contracts exponentially more valuable. A song earning $5,000 annually in 2000 might generate $50,000 today through streaming, sync licensing, and renewed interest in classic rock. The financial structures governing the band's catalog were established during vinyl's dominance, when albums typically sold for a while before fading from commercial relevance. Digital streaming fundamentally changed this model, creating nearly perpetual revenue streams. While a gold record might have generated substantial songwriter royalties during the 1970s before sales slowed, those same songs now produce endless small payments from streaming platforms. This digital revolution created an unexpected windfall for Robertson, who had acquired ownership of publishing rights decades earlier. Unlike contemporary acts who negotiate digital royalties for all band members, the band's contracts had no provisions for technologies that didn't exist when their agreements were made. This blind spot in their original deal now generates millions in streaming revenue, flowing primarily to publishing rights holders. The timing couldn't have been more consequential. As Helm recovered financially through his Midnight Ramble concerts and 3 consecutive Grammy-winning albums in his final years, each earning him approximately $250,000, the true value of the group's recorded legacy was multiplying exponentially. But the 90-10 publishing split established decades earlier meant Robertson maintained overwhelming control of their most valuable asset, the songs themselves. This split translated to approximately $800,000 annually for Robertson, while Helm received just $88,000 from the same catalog. This imbalance fueled ongoing conflicts even after most band members had passed away. Today, the ownership structure includes Robertson's estate and Garth Hudson as the only surviving member, while the estates of Helm, Danko, and Manuel hold their respective interests. Yet the financial value flows primarily through the publishing rights channel that Robertson dominated throughout their history. The stark division that defined the musical collective's later years was being further magnified by this silent multiplication in catalog value. While performing members had struggled for every dollar, their collective work was generating wealth that would exceed all the money they'd earned during their active years combined. Industry standards suggest their catalog could be valued at tens of millions in today's market, a fortune that continues to be distributed according to contracts signed when Richard Nixon was president. "It's like having your legacy stolen from you piece by piece," Helm told the New York Times in 2004, his voice barely above a whisper following his cancer treatments. "When I see our songs used in commercials and I get a check for $6,000 while someone else gets $600,000, I feel like I'm watching my life's work being slowly erased." The pain in Helm's eyes during this interview revealed wounds that went beyond financial harm. This was about recognition, respect, and having a voice in how his life's work was remembered. The Midnight Ramble sessions that began in Helm's Woodstock barn transformed from a financial necessity into a cultural phenomenon, attracting artists like Elvis Costello, Emmylou Harris, and Alan Toussaint. These intimate shows not only revitalized his career but provided him financial stability that decades in one of rock's most celebrated groups never did, with each session generating approximately $20,000 in revenue. Meanwhile, the conflict over who truly deserves credit and compensation for the musical catalog continues. Recent legal filings suggest these disputes may escalate as streaming platforms further increase catalog values. The question remains: will these decades-old contracts governing millions in streaming revenue ever be renegotiated? This ongoing battle illustrates how the music industry's traditional emphasis on songwriting credits over performance created vast wealth disparities among musicians who shared the same stage, recorded the same albums, and built the same legacy. In this case, it means Robertson's estate controls assets worth tens of millions, while other members' families receive comparatively modest benefits from their collective work. Today, many modern bands structure their songwriting credits more equitably than these musicians did, having learned from their painful example. The financial war that tore apart these 5 pioneering musicians has become a powerful lesson for the music industry. How different might their legacy be if they'd focused on fair agreements from the start? Contemporary artists now prioritize clear contracts from day one, ensuring all creative contributors receive fair compensation. Like a bridge between eras, this flawed business model has transformed industry practices. Today's musicians negotiate publishing rights with greater awareness of long-term implications, with many groups adopting all for one, one for all songwriting credits that prevent the disparities that developed among these pioneering artists. Their legacy isn't just timeless music, but also the business lessons they provided, showing that when artistic harmony meets financial discord, everyone loses. Their story reminds us that collaboration and fairness must coexist for music to truly endure, a lesson learned at great cost by some of rock's most influential pioneers.